So, hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to Fit. And here we have Victor from Victor Black Masterclasses. So, first of all, I would just give you a short introduction of Victor, who's Victor. And from there on, I'll let Victor take over the session and walk you through about what you can expect from him from this podcast. We'll be primarily talking about performance enhancing drug, their usage in bodybuilding and maybe in the fitness industry, how we can optimize your performance, and to what an extent you can have this used for a prolonged period of time, keeping your health markers safe. Okay, so Victor, in fact, I have been interacting with Victor from past, in fact, more than 7 months, and I've been following his content. He has fabulous content. In fact, I have read several books. I have read books from several authors from top coaches across the globe and have also seen their protocol when it comes to drug. But when it comes to safety, there are always some sort of say dilemma. It is always indicative. There is no certain thing that anybody can talk about. Everything, if you call about PCT, if you call about dosages, if you call about the frequency of dosages in those compounds, nobody can be 100% sure on that. But somehow, when I have interacted with Victor, I found that yes, there is a way which is much safer in comparison to anybody I have heard or maybe seen so far. And the best part about Victor that I have seen so far is whatever he says, it's no bro science. He backs that with an evidence, with the evidence proper. And that's why, in fact, in case you see, there are a lot of bro science people, bro science bodybuilders who come on his page. Initially, I used to see that they claim some sort of thing, but they could never back it by any sort of evidence. So over a period of time, which you see, Victor, initially I saw that Leo and Derek also, in fact, pointed certain things. But since they learned from you, from your content, they were not able to back that with data,
Mm.
which is why I do no longer see any sort of dispute, any sort of haters on your page anymore. And you're growing like anything. Congratulations for that. Over to you, Victor.
Thank you. It's been a very long it's been a
Yeah,
very long journey. I won't fabricate the truth and say that I haven't had my share of conflict with the community at large. Rather than singling out individuals, I would say the community at large.
hmm
And as you said, the principal reason behind that is much of what is handed down as education in our community is really based on people making things up. In very simply, sort of like there's a lot of what we would call bro law. That when you start pulling on the threads and asking, well, what's the origin point for that? What is the source of that information? It's in some cases just impossible to identify what the origin point of that was, and a large part of what I try to do is to provide my opinion that has been formed over 40 years, almost 40 years in the game now, but also to share how I arrived at those opinions. So not just my experience, but also quoting the clinical literature where it's available to kind of merge the two together. I'm a very big believer, passionate believer in what's referred to as evidence-based practice. And
Yep.
and if I can just have the latitude of explaining what evidence means is not necessarily what the science says, but a blending of the world of observation and anecdote, what we see in practice, with what the evidence has to offer, and bringing the two together, and trying to find behaviors or practices that can be supported with clinical
Absolutely.
literature, and so it's really important to say both of those things. That's really what I try to teach people. It's important, in my opinion, to stand in the middle of these two worlds. It is unfortunately common practice to say that most people lean too heavily into one side or the other. In other words, if they can't find a study to support something, then there is an opinion. Well, that cannot be true because we don't have evidence to support it. I
Ex-
don't agree with that. At the same time, you know having observations or having anecdotes that fly in the face of everything that the science says, that doesn't make sense either. And so I tried to my best to marry these two worlds together.
Totally agree with you. Totally agree with you.
Right.
So, how long you have been having an exposure with pets? What's your background, and how long you have been into this field?
Yeah. So I'm in my mid 50s now. I have been interested in physique development my entire life. I didn't get into bodybuilding because I had aspirations of competition. Quite bluntly, I did not like the way I looked when I was younger. As a young teenager, even I was teased and bullied for my physical appearance, and was
Mm-hmm.
drawn to physique development really as a way of offsetting that bullying, that harassment, as it were. So because of the way I was drawn into the community, it happened very early. It happened, I mean, kids are cruel. At 12, 13 years old, I was, interested in finding a way to change my outward physical appearance. So it's
Mm-hmm.
really been a journey that started there. That's, 40 odd years. 20 of those years I trained and competed as a natural bodybuilder in competition. And for the last 18, 19 years, I have been enhanced. In other words, I use performance enhancing drugs to supplement or to complement my training and nutritional practices towards that end. So yeah, it's about 50-50 now. About half of my time has been in the natural tested bodybuilding world,
Mm-hmm.
and half in the enhanced world.
Okay, so when you call it enhanced, so is it some sort of moderate usage or slightly on a higher usage, or maybe in fact a TRT or HRT on that context?
Yeah, I guess that's one of the great challenges of dialogue within our tribe. What does it mean? What does enhanced mean?
Uh-huh.
Technically, one of the problems that we have with communicating to the research community and communicating to the medical community about our practices is there are really thousands of studies that demonstrate the deleterious effects of performance enhancing drugs on human health. This is
Yep.
really not a question. Like anyone that was wants to walk around saying, look, there's no consequence to exposure is just naive in the extreme. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
This is not really a discussion. The challenge, of course, becomes, well, there is such a thing as what is considered to be clinically effective and for all purposes tolerable treatment practices that we would call hormone replacement therapy practices. So
Mm-hmm.
most of the drugs that we use in the bodybuilding and strength athlete community, of course, they're not developed for our community, for our tribe. They are developed for clinical deployment for people that have a medical condition that may benefit from the therapeutic application of those drugs. So drugs like testosterone, recombinant human growth hormone, recombinant insulin, and all of the testosterone derivatives that we colloquially refer to as anabolic steroids,
Mm-hmm.
these were all developed for clinical practice. Of course, they weren't developed for athletic purposes, but rather for therapeutic practices. And so if you understand that these drugs have a therapeutic application, there is considered to be a range of tolerance that's accepted by the medical community. But
Yep.
obviously, as you increase the dose, and also as you potentially start to stack more than one compound on top of each other,
Mm-hmm.
then you inevitably eventually get to the point where you would say that is an unsustainable practice that eventually will lead to your demise. It's either some type of drug-induced organ injury, yeah, or potentially, in extreme examples, even death of the individuals. This is very fair, but it's also you have to be practical and say, well, somewhere between clinically effective and considered to be acceptable practices. Yeah, I don't like using the word safe. I use the word safer in my materials. Somewhere between that premise of it's okay for a medical doctor to give you a treatment model using these compounds and what we would call outright abuse. Somewhere in there is a range of what we would consider to be, plausibly safer use. In other words, our ability to leverage the therapeutic benefits of these drugs without unnecessary, and undue risk to the individual. And this is the domain that I try to live in. That I try to specialize in. Where is the gray area that transitions from, if we were to use the example of testosterone, where's the
Mm-hmm.
gray area between testosterone replacement therapy for a man that is not producing enough testosterone and might benefit from its application medically, and
Mm-hmm.
abuse? There is a range in the middle where 60 years of anecdote and 60 years of observation, and as I said, a significant body of clinical literature would suggest that we can tolerate a margin in that zone somewhere. Now, as you mentioned at the beginning of the call, it's very difficult to make hard statements about exactly what that is. And that's really what my material is about, trying to understand. So, what is that gray area? What might we expect in terms of a return? What are the
Hmm.
risks that are involved? And how might we mitigate those risks so that we can leverage those drugs for performance benefits that, you know, ideally what I would consider to be acceptable risk profiles for athletes.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you. So just touch basing on the therapeutic use that you said about few of the drugs like testosterone and sustanon and decadurovalin as well.
Mm-hmm.
So you see there are small ampules of these if you go to a medical shop or maybe to a pharmacy, which are absolutely for, as you rightly mentioned, for therapeutic use for people who are suffering with cancer, breast cancer, natural muscle loss, sarcopenia, several diseases for which these anabolics are being considered in particular clinical purposes. So, if anybody, irrespective of their age bracket, is using for those purposes, how long they can take it without having adverse effect with the same amount of dose. If in case I take example of the testosterone, um, um, 100 100 mcg for that, how long they can take it without having an adverse effect on their bodies.
Okay. So you asked about a number of potential medical conditions that might benefit from the application of these compounds, but I think it's an easier conversation if we contain the conversation to talk about testosterone replacement therapy, at least in this instance, yeah.
Yeah.
Testosterone replacement therapy, which is a medical practice that would be indicated to an individual who did not manufacture testosterone at
Yep.
acceptable levels. And what I mean by that, for quality of life, yeah, through age related hormonal decline or potentially some injury to the testicular axis, or there's a number of reasons we might find an individual
Yep.
presents with very, very low testosterone levels. Now, let's assume an individual presents to us, and for all intents purposes, other than being what we would say is hypogonadal, not having enough testosterone, for all
Yep.
intents purposes, that is an otherwise healthy young man. Okay?
Hmm.
So the idea of then using testosterone exogenously, which means introducing it from an external source, right,
Yep.
is really then for that individual going to be a lifetime practice. We're going to administer that drug at a defined level to produce a defined outcome for life. Yeah. So it's not something that you would give him for a certain number of weeks. Why? Because obviously, when then you remove that external application of that drug, the precondition that we gave the drug to him in the first place simply represents. Yeah. So in a go
Back.
ahead.
That will never come back.
Yeah, well, his testosterone production is unlikely to return. Like, it
Yep.
is obviously dependent upon. So why is he hypergonadal? Is part of the diagnosis in the first place. Yeah, it is plausible that an individual is going through a transitory period where they're not producing testosterone for a reason that we can remedy through some other means. Yeah, I'm referring to someone. Let's say, for example, someone had a trauma to their testicles and they were damaged and they were unable to produce testosterone naturally. This is not a common occurrence, but it does happen. Yeah. So let's just suggest that has occurred, or inversely, someone is simply experiencing age-related hormonal decline. They're in the age bracket that I am. Perhaps they're in their 50s or older. There is an acceptance within the endocrine community that age-related hormone decline does happen to individuals as we age, and certainly it's possible that someone will present and simply not make enough testosterone, so that clinical practice of administering testosterone, this is a lifetime practice. Okay,
Yep.
so the challenge then becomes this, and obviously that is contingent upon us monitoring that individual for any plausibly adverse effects. So
Hmm.
if we gave them medication to treat this for quality of life, we're going to then ask what possible problems might present themselves through the application of that medication for life. Yeah.
Yep.
And we could obviously go through the list, some possible indications of things like elevated hematocrit levels, elevated blood pressure, so hypertension. There are a number of plausibly deleterious outcomes. Now, that wouldn't necessarily mean if we saw those things, we would remove the therapy, we would remove the drugs, but we would address those problems. Yep.
Yep.
Okay. So the question is, I mean, you mentioned a dose. I mean, you did say MCG. We quote testosterone typically in milligrams, not micrograms. But let's say we were to give someone 100 milligrams of testosterone a week. That would result in a serum level of testosterone. In other words, an amount of testosterone in the blood of that individual that does vary wildly, I mean massively, on an inter-individual basis. So if you gave that same dose of testosterone under the same conditions to 10 different clients, you're going to see a different result in each of those 10 individuals. There'll obviously be an average or a mean, but typically you would see someone that was a low responder and someone that potentially was a high responder as well. And so typically what we'd do is we would give them a dose of testosterone and then we would adjust for effect. We would titrate for effect, yeah? Now, the argument becomes if we gave someone 100 milligrams and that was considered acceptable for lifetime exposure, provided we were monitoring their health markers, might we increase that dose incrementally at some point, plausibly crossing the natural production threshold, yeah, and start to realize therapeutic benefits that are not plausibly possible for a natural, right? But at the same time, still containing the potential side effects, you know, within reason. And this is, again, I'm somewhat repeating myself here. This is my space, yeah. So we're not trying to simply replace testosterone levels, testosterone replacement therapy. We're looking at seeding those levels into the what is colloquially referred to as the supraphysiological range. In other words, outside the boundaries of natural production. And clearly, I think it's fair to say, more works more. Yeah, in terms of improvements to body composition, in terms of improvements to, you know, what we would call, you know, force production, our ability to basically, you know, move tonnage in the strength, you know, athlete space. More works more, but as we increase the dose, those problems that we are looking for, even in testosterone replacement therapy, are one more likely to present. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And also the magnitude of the event that we see is likely to be larger, yeah? So if we saw elevation of, you know, blood pressure at testosterone replacement therapy, is a very plausible outcome. You may well see that event. The likelihood of that presenting as we elevate the dose becomes greater and greater and greater. So we would more likely see it, and then the size of the increase would plausibly be, or potentially be greater, of course, yeah.
Yep.
So
what I've seen and what I've heard from people as well in the industry, that if in case you want to have a TRT, take microdosing and maybe 100 mg is a good amount to start with. And yes, as you rightly mentioned, every body will respond differently to any specific dose. So for each and every drug, is that true? That every responder is different? So if yes, how do we assess and how do we come to a conclusion that this specific person will respond best to this composition, this person will respond best to this composition? Because if in case this is not known, everyone, every athlete, or maybe every bodybuilder will have to first try all of those to actually check which is actually affecting on me. So if in case I take my example, I'll have to check DECA, I'll have to check trend, I'll have to check all compound of testosterone, each and winstrol, each and everything I have to test on myself and then see. Because I may be having different sort of receptors, alpha receptors, beta receptors, I would be having different with anybody else. I will grow differently, the other person would be growing differently. So how to address that? That with a minimum sort of drug usage, you can have maybe instigate the process. You can influence your body, get into an anabolic phase, and then grow to the maximal.
Yeah. So there's a lot in there. Let me try to address a couple of questions. Firstly, I just want to correct one thing, like you said about the different receptors. Yeah.
Yeah.
So anabolic steroids are a class of compounds derived from the testosterone molecule, and effectively, as a parent hormone, they bind with the androgen receptor. Yep.
Yeah.
So we only have one androgen receptor. We don't have different androgen receptors for different derivatives of testosterone. There's no such thing, for example, as a DHT receptor. It's simply an androgen receptor. Now, is it true that we have different inter-individual genetic response? Absolutely true. So how would we go through that process? It really is a process of first saying, look, we can make generalized statements about certain types of drugs based on typical response. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So if we lined up 100 individuals and we executed a strategy, the mean of that would be this. We'd like to see this on a basis if you are capped an average and you fit into the middle of the bell curve, as it were. We could
Yeah.
predict what you might see, but the challenge, of course, is there are always outliers. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and although statistically, I mean, a good example would be this. Statistically, you're just as likely to be Pee Wee Herman as you are Ronnie Coleman. Doing far more
Yep.
likely as you fit into the middle of the bell curve and you just capped an average. So what I
Yep.
would say is we would begin that conversation with a generalized understanding of what these compounds typically do in typical application in typical males or typical females. Yeah. And then we would basically have to say, but you might well be one of those outliers. It's completely plausible. And so it's very much the same as anything else in a way. Let's say we looked at, different techniques of training, applying resistance to muscle fibers. Yeah.
Yep.
We could say, okay, so we, lean into the style of like how much volume an individual might need. So we might say, look, a typical individual is capable of doing 80 hard working sets a week, but that's typical. There are going to be individuals out there that can tolerate more than that, and those particular individuals, we might be able to leverage that fact to be able to do higher volume load. So as people age, and genetics and sex and hormonal profile and food intake and all sorts of things is going to determine just how much volume load that you can tolerate, before you have to effectively consider whether you're overtraining. Yeah. In the same way that we would say, look, here's a general framework that applies to most people, but understand that there are always outliers. Yeah.
Yep.
We take the same approach to drugs, say, look, here's a typical framework. We know that most people will respond to testosterone in the following way. Most people respond to nandrolone decaonate, which is decadurabolin, the term that you used here. This is the marketing term for the drug, in a certain way. But obviously, different drugs will speak, if I use that language, speak to different people in different ways. Okay.
Yep.
So an example, you may have heard of the drug Masteron and the drug Primobolan. There
Mm-hmm.
are
Yep.
certain things that we can say as blanket statements about this drug. In other words, they are both drugs that are typically injected. They are typically not given in oral format. They
Mm-hmm.
don't add to our estrogen profile. They don't add to our DHT profile. We know this. Yeah.
Yep.
Typically, a drug like Masteron, anecdotally, a lot of people report a better, what we call mechanical response. In other words, like they'll see a better strength profile increase from that drug. But I would encourage people to try both of those drugs. So we would say, okay, so we're going to expose you to Masteron. What did you think? What did we see? What did we observe on an individual effect basis? And then we'll expose you to Primobolan. It's completely plausible that your feedback is going to be different to mine.
Yep.
Yeah. So part of what you said is true. At some point, you need to go, well, this is what we know about these compounds, and then we apply it to the individual and see how they respond as a genetically unique individual.
Okay. So this brings me to a point. Uh, since everybody reacts differently to different drugs, accordingly, the deleterious effect of all these anabolics will also be different from each individual. Somebody's liver may get a lot more toxic in comparison to anybody else.
Yep.
Likewise, for the heart conditions as well, for the kidneys as well, everybody will have a different sort of time frame in which it becomes to a level where it is not tolerable.
Hmm.
Am I correct?
That is 100% correct. It's not only genetics though; it's also all of the other behaviors that you might have in your life. I'll give you an example, right? If you said, look, right now I'm under a tremendous amount of stress, I'm having financial difficulties in my life. My wife and I are arguing a lot. We have 5 children and we're struggling to support them. So you can understand that individual is going to be what we would call a highly stressed individual. Yep.
Absolutely.
Take that same person a year later, things have improved in his life. He's found harmony and peace, sort of thing, and moved on. Da da da. Those two environments in the same individual will produce a different outcome when we apply a secondary, or hell, this may be a tertiary stressor. One of the problems with stresses is all stress is cumulative. Your body does not differentiate between positive stress and negative stress. We could see training as a stressor as such. We would say those behaviors that are happening outside the gym are a stressor, the drugs are a stressor. So in other words, you can take, not only is that true amongst individuals, it's true on an individual based on what else is happening in his life at that time. Okay. So it's one of the things that I always recommend to guys. There's a time to push on and there's a time to pull ourselves in check. If things aren't working out for you right now in life, we all have good days and bad days. This is just life. Yeah. And I would argue that if you're going to take the stresses of enhancement practices on, one, you should pick your poison. And what I mean by that is, I'm not judging people that wish to take in alcohol or, again, different cultures have different exposure to things, but I think it's fair to say most people would recognize cultures like Australia, where I'm from, and America. We have an attitude to recreational drugs, which is somewhat kind of like, liberal. People, do use recreational drugs. It's a part of life. So people that are drinking, people that are using recreational drugs, people are having financial duress, people are this, people are that. These are stresses. I would say, look, you need to consider those factors before you even look at enhancement, because 1 + 1 is 3 in that domain of adding stresses together. So yes, you're absolutely right, but not only into individual, but also the circumstance that individual faces at that snapshot in time.
Totally agree with you. Totally agree with those.
Yeah.
So while my conversation with Bill Campbell, so in that conversation, it was in context with diet and nutrition. In this context, I would want to understand from you that shorter dosages in terms of the volume I'm talking about for a longer period of time, or heavy dosages for a shorter period of time, what would you recommend and why?
I think it's fair to say, you have to be honest and say, well, both work. To say that only one of those models works is not representing the facts correctly. So this is one of the great challenges that I have always had with the community is very little about what I say is about works. Yeah. You can do a whole bunch of things in our world that work, that produce an outcome, but I would argue is well, maybe that's not a great idea in the long term. Yeah. So let's just use this analogy. You're standing with 2 doors before you. One of those doors is literally what we would refer to as the blast and cruise model. Now,
Yeah.
what defines blast and cruise? It's literally defined by a period of time, typically predetermined. We set that before we begin the process, where we expose ourselves to drugs that we know are going to cause stress. We accept they're going to cause stress, right? And we do it as long as we think we can get away with it for. And then when we reach a point where we go, okay, so we're pushing our fortunes here a little bit, we stop and give ourselves a break from those stresses with an intent of washing off the stress created in the blast process. I think that's a fair description. Yep. Okay. That works, right? But there's no denying that, yes, but you're creating stresses. Yeah. The other argument would be this, well, how far can we push these drugs up, right, to the point whereby we're realizing some of the therapeutic benefits, at least, maybe not all of the therapeutic benefits, but some of them. But the side effect profile, the stress profile that's attached to that is such that we can extend the exposure period. Okay.
Yep.
And really, it's a case of if we use 2 examples. Let's say we said, right, a simple analogy. We're at the traffic lights, and sitting next to us is where there's a couple of teenage kids in the hot hatch, ning 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 ning, and they take off at the traffic lights. There's no question that 100 meters down the road they're pulled out in front. Yeah. But the reality is we drive another 500 meters down and they're sitting at the traffic lights as we pull up, right? So we've both arrived at the same destination, yeah?
Yeah.
but the argument is, well, who created the greatest stresses on their machinery, as it were, right? I think it's a very obvious answer to kind of go like, well, we've both got to where we're going to, but you really didn't get there any faster than me because, ultimately you had to stop if you saw the stop sign as a thing. So there's a lot of analogies that we can use here, but I think most people get that. So you have two doors and you have to choose which one that you wish to walk through. There's the blast and cruise model, which you expose yourself to stress, you push the envelope as far as you're willing to push, as far as your perceived risk profile goes, and then you take a break. The intention of that break is washing away that stress, and then you rinse and repeat. Or I prefer the model is I'm trying to figure out where can I live so I can pick up some of the therapeutic benefits, but to create a model that doesn't create stress that I need to take a break. Okay, so if I think it's personal choice. There's some people that are going to look at that model and the blast and cruise will still appeal to them. And I would say, well, that works. Yeah. But I
Yep.
also think there's a certain percentage of the people that go, no, that kind of makes sense. Slow and steady wins the race. It's the parable of the hare and the tortoise. And we'll just chip away at this process, moving forward, moving forward, moving forward. A
Hmm.
great analogy I would use here is a lot of these frameworks, a lot of these principles are based on my background as a natural bodybuilder. In
Hmm.
natural bodybuilding, consistency and relentless progress towards your goal is that's the cornerstone of natural bodybuilding. It's not
Yep.
we make progress for 12 weeks and then we stop. It's just you apply the inputs of food and nutrition and sleep hygiene and stress management, and ideally you just keep moving forward as a natural, keep moving forward. Inevitably, eventually you get to the point where progress initially slows and then stalls. And this is the point where typically people are faced with the question of, do I open the Pandora's box of enhancement practices or
Yeah.
not? Yeah.
Correct.
But natural bodybuilding is not premised on periods of growth and periods of resting and periods of growth and periods of resting. Typically it's the gentle but relentless application of inputs. And I just lean into that model. I believe it makes sense. I believe, when you look at, our practices, there's a very big difference between what you can get away with for 20 weeks and what you can get away with for 20 years. It's very
Um,
difficult to argue that. And I hold myself up as just one example of people in our community who I've been doing this for 20 years now, and people say, oh, it's the devil's poison, it's going to kill you. Well, clearly not. It's certainly possible to do this, but you have to make a choice between, like, it's either you can do this for a short time quite acutely with the foot on the gas, as I like to say, or you can come back a little bit and be a little bit more moderate, a little bit more considered in your practices, and extend the time frame of exposure into really a lifetime of exposure rather than a couple of years.
okay, great. Very well explained on the point of stressors, and that was a great analogy made, Victor. Thank you for that. So there was one question. So today morning in the gym, there was a young lad which came up to me and asking because I told him that I'm connecting with Victor today
Mm.
evening, and he was very excited to know a few aspects that can no amount of good quality of training, good quality of periodization, good quality of nutrition training supplement can be compared to having anabolics.
It's an interesting question. I think it's the wrong question. Let me ask the right question because
Yeah.
I get where it's coming from. What I would argue is this: natural training, okay, can carry you so far. Yeah. But if you do everything right, you just have to follow the journeys of the elite natural bodybuilders of this world.
Hmm.
Let's say you were fortunate enough to be pulled under the wing of an elite natural bodybuilder in your first year of training. Very few people have that luxury. Most people fumble about for a couple of years trying to figure things out before they actually figure out what's going on, right? But let's just say, hypothetical situation, a young man comes along, let's say he's 23 years old. Yep.
Hmm.
Hasn't
Yep.
really been involved in body. He just walks into the gym at the right moment of time and the stars are aligned and he meets a guy who takes him under his wing and says, I'll show you how to do it the right way. I think that in that first year of what I would call natural training, he can see steroid like results. Yeah.
Hmm.
What we would refer to as newbie gains. They hand them out on paper plates for basically turning up and doing the right thing. Yeah. but that doesn't last forever. That's not a line that goes off, into the future in perpetuity. You typically see that for a year or maybe two. Okay, after about a year, 18 months, 2 years, it's fair to say that people's results first slow. Okay, and eventually they it's not the fair that they say they stop, but they become so slow that it almost feels like you're stopped. It almost feels like nothing's happening. And I this is the reason I transitioned to enhanced training myself, right?
Yeah.
I carried on for 20 years like an idiot, but what I would basically say is really my first couple of years were very productive. The second couple of years still positive, but not the same return as the first. But eventually you get to the point where all the time, all the money, all the effort, it's for what? And this is where when we look at natural bodybuilders, we would typically look at someone and say that's plausibly natural and that guy has to be using drugs. Look at his physique, right? Now, what I would be very careful is where that line is, because I spent the last 10 years of my career with everybody telling me I was cheating and using drugs. So I'm a little bit defensive towards that. We have to understand 20 years of natural bodybuilding. I didn't look plausibly natural by the time I finished. I squeezed every drop you could get out, yeah?
Oh.
And then it was only when I started taking drugs and I started growing again, people went, "Holy crap, he was telling the truth." Like I thought he was lying. But a lot of people apologized to me afterwards and they said, "I seriously thought you on the drugs." And the only reason I realized that, well, I started growing again. Yeah. So what I would say is I would set a benchmark. Let's again talk about average, right? I
Mm-hmm.
would say the average guy has 3 to 5 years of progress as a natural trainer if you're doing everything right. If you're eating, sleeping, stress management, nutrition, of course, is king. You know, the appropriate supplementation in over-the-counter supplements that we can talk about. Yeah, you get 3 to 5 years of progress, and after that, it really does slow down to the point of like it feels like you're not moving. Now, what I would argue is you can still see changes to the one physique. Yeah, you can, if you're competing, put a different look on stage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you might get better at conditioning. You might get better in some way. You go like so he competed. He looked different this year versus last year, but he's not going to be 10 pounds heavier on stage. Those days are behind us. Yeah. At that point, once you reach that point, the only way to keep moving forward really is the introduction of growth promoting agents that are considered to be banned substances by most sporting authorities, whether that's anabolic steroids, whether that's growth hormone, whether that's insulin or other compounds. There's a very, very long list of compounds that are considered banned in natural competition, in tested competition. So there is a point where it just stops. But I would argue it's further than most people think, especially in today. There's a whole culture of, I'm sure you've seen it on YouTube and things like that. People claim natty or not. Do you know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean?
Yep.
So I look at myself and I go, I got to 100 kilos. I mean, just for context, today, like if I weighed myself, I'm about 120 odd kilograms. Yeah,
Oh, really?
yeah. I
Yeah.
I got to similar body composition at about 105 naturally.
Oh.
You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So those last 15 kilos, I simply would not have realized that return without drugs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So today I'm not plausibly natural. You can't walk around at my age, mid 50s, at 120 kilograms in the body composition I am without drugs. It's not humanly possible.
Uh-huh.
No one I know has managed to pull that off. Um, so yeah, hopefully that explains it. There is a threshold you get to where you go, and
It
as
does.
a general rule of thumb, I'll just tell people so how it works within our community. People that know what they're talking about, we would typically say, look, when you look at elite naturals on stage, it's very rare that you see someone that breaks 200 pounds in stage condition. Very
Mm-hmm.
rare, right? To put that into context, in in the 1970s when they filmed Pumping Iron, I'm sure you're familiar with the movie Pumping
Yep.
Iron. Yep. So Arnold and two other competitors, Lou Ferrigno and the gentleman Serge, they were over. There was three
So,
guys in the yeah. So there was three guys in the over 200 pound class. Three.
uh-huh.
Yeah, that's it in the world, right? So today we know more about nutrition, we know more about training, we know about, you can get natural guys that can break that barrier, but they don't get much over 200 pounds. I
Yep.
would be looking closely at someone that was, I mean, if someone's still on the stage at 220 pounds, I'm not saying it's not possible, but that would be very unusual. That would be a tremendous outlier, the likes of Ronnie Coleman, not Citizen Joe turning up to the gym and managing to get that far. That would be an outlier to the curve.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, at times, what happened? This question is specifically for the younger population. What you can expect from a drug and what you cannot.
Mm-hmm.
What can a good drug do to your body and what it will not do to your body?
Yeah,
And
that's a really good question because it's
yeah.
what I try to teach people, and that is this: if you start as a natural, all
Mm-hmm.
you need is that you need to basically understand that there's a relationship between what we call muscle protein synthesis and muscle
Yeah.
protein breakdown, right? Most people walk around the planet where these two conditions effectively balance each other out on a daily, weekly basis. In other words, they don't acquire nor do they lose skeletal muscle tissue. They're
Yep.
relatively static. Yeah. The process of bodybuilding, is really a case of trying to tip in our favor by a small margin muscle protein synthesis. So gradually, over time, we are acquiring new protein tissue, right?
Yep.
But we don't need the difference between these two things to be massive. We just need it to be relatively small, but constantly. So, 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, we're gradually acquiring tissue mass. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Like you.
Someone that's in a muscle wasting state, they have a disease. You mentioned the disease, sarcopenia,
Yeah.
cancer related cachexia. There are all sorts of conditions, muscular dystrophy, where they had a muscle wasting condition. Pretty much the inverse is true, where muscle protein breakdown exceeds muscle protein synthesis. But interestingly, not by a large margin. Usually it's just a small amount, and gradually, as years go by, they waste away, and you see they carry less and less and less tissue. Yep.
Yep.
So, if you understand that most people are in balance, people who have muscle wasting diseases, there is an imbalance in the favor of breakdown, and bodybuilding is all about creating thing. All a drug is intended to do is to basically take someone who's a natural, right, and for all intents and purposes is stuck. Yeah. They can no longer get muscle protein synthesis rates to exceed muscle protein breakdown rates, so they can't move forward anymore, and skew that ratio in our favor again to reignite or restart the process, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what people are surprised by is the number of different drugs and the amount of drugs that you need to do that is quite interesting. Lots of drugs will do that. Yeah. And the amount you need is not really very much to begin
Yeah.
with. Yeah. And the interesting thing is, so the drugs that we choose then become not a case of works or does not work. Lots of things will work, right? It's a
Mm-hmm.
question about efficacy and safety profile. So,
Mm-hmm.
an example. If we were to take a drug like, I'll just use an extreme example, the drug colloquially referred to as Superdrol. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
This is a drug that will do that, but it is, a methylated oral drug that is highly toxic to the liver system.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So we could use methylated, master. So we could use Masteron, for example, or we could use the methylated version of Masteron, which is Superdrol. If we compare the two, well, they both work, right, to create this imbalance. But
Yeah.
one of them, because of the methylation process, right, has potentially more downside,
Mm-hmm.
right? So drug selection is a case of, well, first we need to pick drugs that work, but there's a lot of drugs that work, an awful lot of drugs work.
Mm-hmm.
Why would we not choose the gentlest, most benign option rather than the most toxic option if they all work?
Totally agree with
Yeah.
you. Yeah.
And this is one of the things that people misunderstand about the world of performance enhancing drugs. They think that this drug will make them grow 5 times faster or 5 times bigger. And this is
Mm-hmm.
one of the bro
That's
laws statements.
pretty.
Yeah,
That, yeah.
about trenbolone's 5 times stronger than testosterone, and going, but there's no evidence to support that at all. Like, not observationally, not in the clinical literature. That's just made up, right? So I'm not saying Trembolone doesn't work, but it's a anabolic steroid that binds with the androgen receptor, and in the case of Trembolone, it also has a new unique relationship with some other receptors in the body, right?
Mhm.
But it's no more anabolic than testosterone is. So we're looking at these two drugs saying, well, they're both doing the same job effectively. They're creating an imbalance between muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown of a
Yep.
large enough magnitude to allow us to move forward where we were stalled as a natural. Yeah. But one of those drugs is potentially more deleterious to our long-term health than the other. Why don't we lean into the most benign, more tolerable drug? This is the very premise of safer use. Here's two options. They both work. Let's pick the gentler option of the two. And too many people in this community incorrectly believe that there are drugs out there that are so powerful that you'll grow 5 times faster or 5 times bigger. You don't need to do that. All you need to do is do what you did when you were natural bodybuilding.
Mhm.
Make sure that muscle protein synthesis rates exceed breakdown rates by a relatively small margin and hold it there for the next 3 to 5 years, and you will realize your goal. Yeah. The magnitude doesn't need to be here. You just need to have a small differential so that you can keep moving forward on your journey.
Yep. Yes, absolutely right. And on this point, what I have in fact heard and what I was reading, that Chris Chris Bumps that I'm talking about had his first cycle as just testosterone. Never had a greater amount of anabolics earlier in his career. It was just anabolics in the name of testosterone that he used for a period of time while he first competed at Mr. Olympia ground.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, absolutely right. Which drug suits your body, which gives the maximum output to your body, that is essential to know. And accordingly, you can
Let,
design
let,
it.
me- let, me, let me just clarify that. I do
Yeah.
not know Chris personally, and I'm not here to question whether he did. It's certainly plausibly true. It's possible. Yeah. Now, however, that would indicate to me that he had a very poor understanding of pharmacology, right? So, in other words, what I mean by that is it's possible. I mean, there are stories, I don't know whether it's true or not, that guys like Ronnie Coleman, first competed and won a pro card as a natural. It's certainly
Yeah.
possible. I've seen photographs of points where Ronnie was plausibly natural. I've seen competitions where Kai Green competed. He was natural, phenomenal as a natural individual. Now, I've heard Ronnie Coleman speak on the subject of pharmacology, and I think it's fair to say that he's quite probably the greatest bodybuilder that ever lived. He's
Hmm.
not he's not the greatest educator of pharmacology that ever lived, though his models are very rudimentary. So, is it true that Chris Bumstead that did that? I don't know. It's certainly possible, but I don't know that I would recommend that model. Why? This is the reason, and that is every drug has the potential to bring a profile that what I would call the great, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Hmm.
Okay. And anyone that is unable to describe the great, the good, the bad, and the ugly of any drug, you should walk away from because it exists. Believe me, every drug has a profile that you need to be able to say, this is good, this is bad. Two sides of the coin. Yep. Testosterone, up to a certain threshold, yeah, is a very good choice of drug for beginners. And I would encourage everybody to begin their base with testosterone. It is, we can rattle off a list of reasons. Let's just keep it really simple. It is effectively, people will argue what bioidentical means, but for all intents and purposes, it is very similar to the testosterone that our body produces. Yes, it's synthetically derived, but for all intents and purposes, it had the same profile. However, as you raise the amount of testosterone you take, inevitably, eventually, you will start to have to deal with the metabolites of testosterone, namely estrogen and the estrogen profile, and
Hmm.
DHT and the DHT profile. And so, what typically people do is they'll take testosterone until they have problems with estrogen, then they'll take an aromatase inhibitor to deal with the estrogen, or maybe they'll take a DHT blocker like finasteride. So they will say, I only use testosterone, but I also manage estrogen this way. I would rather they took as much testosterone as they could tolerate as a genetically unique individual. And when they reach that threshold, rather than use an aromatase inhibitor or use a DHT blocker, they simply held their testosterone levels there and introduced a secondary compound, one
Mm-hmm.
that didn't bring more metabolites, estrogen and DHT to the table. So here's the question. I don't know Chris. I don't know that story. I've never heard that story before. It's interesting. But if he was saying I only use testosterone, but I also used an AI to manage the estrogen, I would say I wouldn't do that. I would use testosterone up to the threshold that you did not need an AI to manage your estrogen. And if that's what he said, kudos to him. Great, that's fabulous. But I have a sneaking suspicion that what he probably meant by that was I was using testosterone. It was the only androgen I was using, and I had these other ancillaries in play. And that's something that I try to steer people away from. Why?
Quite possibly he must have used it.
Yeah, I have a sneaking suspicion that he
Okay.
probably was. Yeah, I'm just guessing, but I think
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
probably true. Now, the reason behind that, just to clarify that, is aromatase inhibitors certainly assist us with estrogen modulation, but they
Mm-hmm.
have no therapeutic benefits at all. They don't bring anything positive to the table at all, right? We are simply using them so that we're at liberty of using too much testosterone, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what I would prefer to use was a drug that had therapeutic benefits in its own right, right? And manage estrogen with a drug that had benefits, right? Not using a drug that had no benefits and only problems associated with use. So whenever I'm faced with a choice of two drugs, and one of those drugs say, well, it doesn't do anything positive for us. I'm only taking it so I can take too much of the first drug.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a strategy that I would typically lean to. A couple of good examples here would be I'm using so much testosterone, I need to manage my DHT with finasteride. I'm using so much testosterone, I need to manage my estrogen profile with an aromatase inhibitor. I'm using so much of this drug that I need to use cabergoline to manage my prolactin profile. I would suggest an alternative model here.
Okay. So, and thanks for bringing that point. That, in fact, is a very interesting point because with whomsoever I have heard so far, it was in combination that once you start taking a good amount of testosterone, you need to have AI, and you also.
Even at TRT levels, most guys that go to their doctor today that are getting testosterone replacement dosages are typically concurrently, prescribed an aromatase inhibitor, and I don't support that practice. I think
So how do you
that's
fight
a
that?
poor
How do
practice.
you fight that? Then, in that case, I think the dosage of testosterone needs to be quite low. Is that so?
As much as you can tolerate without one. So
Okay.
if you happen to be a particularly robust individual, I know guys that can say I can take 500 milligrams a week of testosterone and I don't have estrogenic related side effects. Then great. That and maybe that was Chris. Yeah, I don't know, as I said, but I have a sneaking suspicion he was probably following the model most guys follow, which is testosterone and an AI. Yeah, and I would say, yeah, now you're using too much testosterone. So again, the model is we would use as much testosterone as we can tolerate as a genetically unique individual without needing an AI. When we
Mhm.
reach that threshold, we would walk a secondary drug in, typically a drug from a DHT derivative family that does not bring more estrogen profile with it. Some examples would be Mastron does not convert to estrogen, Primobolan does not convert to estrogen, Anavar does not convert, Winstrol does not convert, Trembolone you mentioned does not convert. So you can see, so you can make a profile of drugs that remove the need to have an AI simply by stopping at that threshold and walking a secondary compound in.
Mhm. So how do you check that? You check that through physical appearance, or you do a blood test for that?
You can do both. The challenge is that estrogen is something that I encourage guys to run high. Why?
Hmm.
Because estrogen is an anabolic pathway in its own right. Yeah. A lot of people don't understand that. Yeah. And then secondarily is elevated androgens have a great many deleterious side effects to our health. We
Hmm.
have concerns about cardiac health, our heart. We have concerns about renal health, our kidneys. We have many different concerns, with
Hmm.
on our brain, the impact of testosterone in the brain. Inversely, estrogen is a hypertrophic pathway in its own right, meaning it's an anabolic pathway, but standalone. and it's cognitive protective of your brain, protective of your heart, protective of your kidneys. So running high androgens is deleterious to the health of your kidneys. Running high estrogens is protective of your kidneys. Yeah. So in
Oh,
other words, I would.
that's,
Sorry.
that's an interesting point.
Yeah. So
So
I would
far,
run as much estrogen as you could tolerate, like, but there's going to be a point when you start to see problems. That's fair. Yeah. The challenge, of course, is so what do we do about it at that point in time? Like you either use an aromatase inhibitor or you simply stop adding more estrogen and you walk another compound in that doesn't convert to estrogen. So again, testosterone and estrogen, as much of these hormones as you can tolerate without deleterious effects. If you
mhm.
cross that threshold, well, we just scale back a little bit, and then
Yep.
once we reach that point, we walk a secondary compound in.
No, that's good. That's great. Because so far, whenever I heard about estrogen, this is something, a evil hormone for males that I'll not take because my will.
Unfortunately, these are the sorts of things that I battle with all the time, where people will simply, they don't appreciate that estrogen is our best friend. Good for the
Up.
bedroom, good for our gains. It's like something you want to encourage. It has this reputation, but it's no different than if you think about a lot of the things you've heard before, like fat's the enemy, carbs are the enemy. Like, come on, how are carbohydrates the enemy? But there are a lot of people that legitimately believe, like you'll hear things like say this, and they'll swear to God, I tried everything that I could. I couldn't lose any weight, and then I tried the ketogenic diet, and like it was fabulous. Like it's just great. Carbs are just like the enemy, right? I would just simply say like that's just not factual. And I'm not saying that that individual didn't enjoy success on a ketogenic diet. That's observationally true. But the reason they enjoyed success is not the carbs are the enemy. During so but you will only get into an argument with people in the low carbohydrate community. You know, there are entire forums, there are entire Facebook groups that are zealots that carbs are the devil's poison, basically, and they still believe this. So this is the problem, and that is there are huge swathes of the community that believe carbs are the enemy. There are huge that believe fat is the enemy. There are people that believe sugar is the enemy. There are people that believe estrogen is the enemy. There are people that believe DHT. And quite bluntly, they're all wrong, and they're all just making things up. What the truth is that they do something and they observe an effect, which is fact. Yeah, but they don't have the capacity to understand, well, what actually caused that. The reason that ketogenic diets work is the reason that all diets work, and that is ultimately caloric control.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right? So, yeah, low carbohydrates work great. I'm not saying they don't, but it's not because carbs are the enemy. It's because you happen to, you know, enjoy low carbohydrate diets. They speak to you for a number of reasons, and the reason that you're successful is you're controlling calories by removing, carbohydrate. So the sorts of things they're removing is cookies and cakes, but you could just as easily do a low fat diet, and remove, like bacon and other high fat source foods from diet and enjoy equal success. So estrogen is by no stretch of the imagination the enemy. It is, in fact, just like carbohydrates, I would argue that quality carbohydrates are our friend, quality fats are our friend, estrogen is our friend, DHT is our
Yeah.
friend. Like, this is just things that people like to make up that don't have an understanding of the underlying science. Yeah.
Correct. Okay. So now my next question is: there is one supplement which is actually sells like a cake. If you consider youth population and even the pro gym goers people, that is test boosters.
Mm.
Test booster, do they really work?
I would say yes, but we have to we have to qualify the conversation. So,
Hmm.
firstly, you need to understand there is what is a plausibly natural limit to testosterone production in healthy young men.
Hmm.
Okay, I don't care what testosterone you booster you take, right? You will never exceed that barrier. Okay, so there is no drug that produces the effects of anabolic steroids that is, quite a herbal supplement or so, whatever like that. That's just not true. And I'll give you an example. I mean, if you take a healthy young man who's going through puberty, he's 13,
Hmm.
14, 15, right? the amount of testosterone that's it's possible for him to produce is in the vicinity of, I don't know whether these numbers will mean anything to you or your readers, but 1,000, 1,100, 1,200 nanograms per deciliter. These are high natural range. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
now, is it possible through the use of testosterone boosters that you can see those types of results? Certainly. Like I've seen it many, many times. A great many natural bodybuilders are leveraging, you know, behaviors, practices, supplements, you know, like to try to get the maximum testosterone production that they can, but you will never exceed those values. And that's important to understand, because, and the reason I say that is because a lot of people are under the perception that they are able to cross that threshold using these compounds, and that is simply overstating the case. Yeah. I
Yeah.
have seen a great many individuals who had what I would call a poor lifestyle, yeah, who have then said, right, I'm going to look after myself better. I'm going to lower my stress levels. I'm going to get better quality sleep. I'm going to start resistance training. I'm going to improve my diet. I'm going to take these supplements, and along that, you know, the idea of supplements, and they've had remarkable improvement in testosterone values. Like, wow, that's really impressive. But I would argue that the reason that they've seen that is not the result of any one of those behaviors, but the accumulation of all of them. In other
Absolutely.
words,
Yeah.
you could take someone who is doing everything right but has a high stress environment, and this can deleteriously affect their testosterone production. You can have someone that has, they go to the gym, they don't eat right, their testosterone production is affected. You could have someone that has a diet that's high in protein and carbohydrates that has a poor micronutrient profile. They don't have enough zinc and magnesium and
Mm-hmm.
these, you know, boron and these types of minerals and essential vitamins and minerals in their diet. And they if you do all of these things right, okay, is it possible that those types of supplements can contribute to that mix? I think that's fair.
Okay.
I think that's fair. Yeah, but we can't overstate. You can't have a shitty diet and not go to the gym and have this and have this and have this and then take this, you know, magical, you know, one spoon of this stuff a day and it fixes all the ills. It just, that it doesn't work that way. Snake oil salesmen have been trying to sell that solution for everything from the beginning of time. Those
Yep.
things work on an individual that's doing everything else right. They can contribute something to the mix, no question. I certainly, when I was a natural, looked at those things. I think that they contribute some small, maybe even sub-fractional return, but I was happy enough spending my money on those things after you do everything else.
Yeah. Yeah, because why I ask this question, because there are quite a few supplements which are in the market and people actually go for them, like Tongat Ali, uh,
Sure.
being D-aspartic acid, and and ashwagandha and shilajit. If you see, they people buy them in the name of testosterone boosters,
Mm.
but when you research, when you read papers on human studies, none of them, apart from if I see Yohim Bean, had a significant effect on testosterone boosting. While if you see some sort of minerals and supplements like taking vitamin D, a good amount of vitamin D and a good amount of vitamin of zinc, it has a good impact, as you rightly mentioned.
Let me qualify that.
Yeah,
Yes, but only individuals who are deficient.
absolutely. Yes,
You see what I'm
yes.
saying? So if you're getting enough, let's use the word magnesium, right? Let's is a good
Hmm.
example. Magnesium is one. Zinc is one of these other things, right? So let's
Yep.
say you have someone who is ingesting through food intake 50
Mhm.
milligrams of zinc a day. That's completely plausible. You can get 50 milligrams of zinc in a bodybuilder diet. A guy that's consuming an appropriate amount of calories for this game, it's possible. Now, if you have someone that's getting 50 milligrams of zinc and he's a natural individual, well, supplementing with a zinc, supplement on top of that 50 milligrams make a wow. No, it doesn't. That's the reality. It doesn't. But if you take someone who is zinc deficient, yeah,
Yeah,
would zinc supplementation make a significant impact in a study format? Yes, but the problem is then that study is almost flawed because you're studying the wrong group of people, if that makes
absolutely.
sense, right? I want to give you the 10 guys you're going to study, and then the zinc is going to do 2/10 of bugger all. Do you see what I'm saying? And this is the challenge with all of these things, and that is these things are only conditionally true.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Thank you for bringing that point. So while I was hearing Milos Sarchev, so there was one very interesting point that he brought towards all these studies while we were talking about the protein consumption for bodybuilders, and he took protein consumption up to 3 grams to 4 grams per kg of body weight, and it had good effect on the physique. So the point that he brought in, that all the research that has been done so far on the protein consumption, where you understand that ideal protein consumption is 1.6 gram per kg of body weight or 2 gram per kg of body weight, is not done on a bodybuilder so far. For protein consumption, there has not been a single study being done on pro bodybuilders. There has been not been none.
On you mean drug using bodybuilders and naturals?
Drug using.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed. The
Yeah.
challenge with that though, even though, is like and this is where I kind of step into understanding the literature and then trying to explain it to people, and that is that if we're looking for a study on enhanced bodybuilders, there are very few. Yeah.
Yeah.
We are effectively taking what I consider to be either surrogate data, rodent models, other animal models, people in nursing homes, they're not us. That's not us. Yeah. So we need to be very careful when we interpret that data about, how far do we lean into it? What I
Hmm.
prefer to do is to look at all of the data that we have on a subject, right?
Yeah.
Let's say there's 100 studies on subject X, which would be a very well researched area of interest, right? And then
Hmm.
I would go, right, so what would my summary be of that? Any particular standout studies that speak to me particularly? Maybe it actually is on bodybuilders. You're in like, that would be of greater interest than something in a nursing home or a rat model, yeah? And then what I would like to do is go, well, then in my 40 years of experience, how do these things line up to each other? Do you know? So the
Yep.
one thing that you talk about bodybuilders again, like, and that is, you know, there's so many threads that you could pull on, that the whole, it's like Jenga, you pull this piece out, the whole card falls apart. I'll give you a simple example, right? It's very different what it takes to create new tissue than it takes to sustain tissue.
Yep.
Okay. Most professional bodybuilders aren't really growing significantly, like, and they're kind of like at the point where they've perfected their physique to a certain degree, or acquired most of the mass that they'll carry in their careers.
Yep.
You know, I'm far more interested in trying to understand what they were doing on the way up than what they're doing now. Do you know? So when you look at the behavior of someone who's a household name, very often what they were doing when they became the household name and what they were doing now are different things. A really good example is Dorian Yates, right?
Hmm.
So Dorian Yates is known for a particular type of training, right? But really, that type of training was something that he merged into by the time we knew who he was. Yeah. So, in other words, if you look at what Dorian was doing in the formative years, it's quite different to what he was doing after he became Dorian, which
Yep.
is of great interest. In other words, and he kind of has these phases like most people in their career. Like nobody that I know has always done the same thing. So we've always followed same training programs or the same nutritional model. People change their philosophies. Like, fucking, I
Yep.
have. I have changed my philosophies many times over the years, which is really interesting, yeah, because that has the potential to affect a great deal of insight. Like you said, like you could line up 100 professional IFB professionals. Let's say the top 100 guys in the game today, and sit down and discuss what they're doing today. Yeah,
Hmm.
but then if you lined up the same 100 guys and were able to, even, I don't know if it's possible, even to wind them back to the first 10 years, you
Hmm.
might be surprised at the difference between those two behaviors. Does that make
Absolutely.
sense? Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Makes
I
sense.
think I think it depends on who the audience is. Like if you're addressing professional bodybuilders at the peak of their career, they're going to be very interested in what that group of 100 guys are doing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But if you address a group of guys that are just starting out, that may well be of little interest. You know, even though they think it's of great interest. I mean, an example would be what Arnold did when Arnold was in, Venice Beach, right? He would train twice a day, train in the morning for 2 hours, eat, sleep on the beach, and go back and train again. Like, hello, I have a wife and family. Do you understand what I mean? That's not going to happen. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So this is where we go about, like we talk about bro law, and things can sometimes be true, but I'm going, yeah, but I'm not sure that is really very meaningful to us.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Circumstances and surroundings are different for people. Yeah.
The surroundings are different, the goals are different, the progression is different, the drug use is different. It's just, and this is where I think if you really want to, learn from other people, one of the most important questions is asking the right questions. Yeah.
Yep.
And I would argue that one of the biggest things that clouds conversations today is we are focused on what Ronnie Coleman was doing when he was Ronnie Coleman, right?
Mm-hmm.
Rather than what was he doing before anybody knew who he was.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And most individuals should probably be more interested in doing what was he doing when he was nobody. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? What was Dorian doing when Dorian was becoming Dorian, to me, is more interested in what he was doing once he was Dorian.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Because I can tell you the behaviors it takes nutritionally and training wise once you acquire certain tissue mass are different than when you're on the journey there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And this is one of the great flaws in the study data that we have that talks about volume load. Yeah. Once you acquire the capacity to apply a certain amount of intensity to training techniques, yeah, once you can mentally activate muscles, you could train in a different way than you need to train in the first 3 or 4 years. You can't. I mean, I don't know whether you relate to this, but a lot of guys they go, I can't feel certain muscles. I can't feel my lats engaging. And then once you cross that threshold, and typically, I'm not saying it's 100% true, but there is a correlation between the amount of tissue that you carry and your capacity to feel the engagement of muscle. There is a correlation there. Yeah, may not be 1-to-1, but it's there. Once you feel that way, you can train differently. Yeah. Once you acquire a certain amount of size, you can take a certain different philosophy towards drug dosages and things like that. And this is the argument that I would say is, in my opinion, from first exposure to drugs, right, to peak value, the most important thing is slow, steady, relentless progress towards your goals.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Correct.
I would rather have, like, look back at a year and go, man, that was a good year. I made ground and I created a relatively small amount of stress for myself. I've moved up a tier, right? Okay. Than to say, yeah, I had a fabulous 20 weeks and I blasted away for 20 weeks and then I had to take 3 months off to wash away the stress. And again, it's not a simple conversation, but I think it's enough to put the flag in the sand and make people aware, depending upon where you're at in your career, these conversations do change. One of the greatest frustrations I have, we're getting a long way off the conversation, I apologize, but I think it's valuable. One of the conversations one of the things that used to frustrate me a lot when I was learning was I would ask 10 people and I would get 10 different questions, 10 different answers, sorry. It was very frustrating going, surely everybody can give me the right. And very often I just wasn't asking the right question of the right people. Do you know?
Yep.
What I would ask a total novice, right, that I respected, let's say he had some sports science degree, but he wasn't really experienced in the gym. He might say one thing, and then someone that didn't have sports science background but had been training for 40 years, he might say another thing. And they're both right, if you know what question to ask. Sometimes we don't even understand what the right question is.
Correct.
Yeah?
Correct.
So, it's very complicated, well off track, but very interesting subject. So nonetheless.
Yep. Absolutely. Totally agree with you.
So we're getting on to it almost an hour and a half here. I'm sure people are glazed over by now. Me listening to an hour and a half is a lot. So maybe let's cover off something to finish this up, because I know from my experience of doing podcasting, usually about an hour and a half is enough for most people.
It's more than enough. Yeah, yes.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah. Is there
so for
anything? Is there anything you wanted to finish up on?
just one short question for beginners, because enhanced are anyways much enhanced in terms of their knowledge as well. Yeah. So for a beginner, what would you recommend, orals or injectables? And if in case a composition of both of them, then what they can begin with?
I think we need to have some latitude here for honesty. Yeah.
Hmm.
I would argue most people, including myself, first exposure was oral steroids. Yeah.
Okay.
Why? Why? Because I was scared of needles. Like, like I remember the first time injecting myself, my hand was like shaking like a leaf. Like, it's just not a normal practice for someone that's not in the medical profession, that hasn't been, to it's. But if someone said to me what's the right way to do it, it's really simple, and that is oral drugs in
Hmm.
general, I'm making here, are not developed by the pharmaceutical industry because they offer better bioavailability, or they offer more clinical efficacy, or they have a better safety profile. Oral drugs are typically developed, or oral formats of drugs are developed to ensure better client adherence to treatment plans. In other words, people don't like injecting themselves. Do you know what I mean? So they make these drugs in an oral format to make it easier for people to take. At the same time, there's usually a list of downsides. So if we take that understanding and go, man, if you can get over the problem of injecting yourself, you should just go straight there.
Yeah.
Oral drugs are not more bioavailable. They're not more clinically effective. They don't have better safety profiles. Oral drugs exist to overcome that problem. So
Yeah.
if you recognize this life is for you, and you recognize your future involves injection, then man up and go straight into the injectables.
Hmm.
Yeah, without question. I didn't, but you have to remember that was 20 years ago. I know a lot more today. If I had the choice over today, I would go straight to injectables. I'm not going to berate someone because they started with Anavar. A lot of us, including myself, did. And we started with this drug or that drug, but eventually, inevitably, you have to migrate to injectable format.
Hmm.
And
Right.
repeating
Yeah.
myself, the only reason that you would start with orals is they're not better in any way for you, right? They just exist to overcome that issue. So if you can get over it, then get over it, because you're going to have to get over it at some point. Yeah.
Yep.
The reason that SARMs saw such a huge surge in popularity is not because they were safer, not because they were more clinically effective, is because, for the greatest extent, for two purposes. One is they existed in an oral delivery format. This is very appealing to that type of individual, right?
Hmm.
And they, for all intents and purposes, were somewhat easier to source because they fell through some legal loopholes, yeah, as not being classified as drugs. I mean, of course they are, but
Yeah, absolutely.
classic things. So I didn't answer that question very clearly. Sorry. Go straight to injectables. I'm not going to berate you if you've done a cycle or two of orals, but you can't.
Yep.
It's not a long term strategy.
Great, great. And one last question. Today, in fact, I was just going through an article and a study which said that, because so far my understanding was that clenbuterol has a good amount of impact on heart health as well. But today, what I was hearing, that it has no impact on heart health for as good as 500 to 700 mcg dosage. Is that
Can you restate that question? Oh, you lost me a little bit there. Yeah.
okay? So, so far my understanding was that clenbuterol has impact on heart health.
Mm.
If it is taken for a prolonged period of time in high dosages, it has impact. But what today I was reading is that in an evidence-based study so far, there was an evidence-based study conducted recently which showed that even at a dose of 700 mcg, it has no impact on heart health.
Okay. I think there's a little bit of crosswire there. So what I would suggest is that um, there is a medical practice, yeah,
Mhm.
of administering clenbuterol at 2,100 micrograms a day. Yeah.
My,
very high dosages. Yeah, it's actually they give 700 micrograms 3 times a day for a total load of 2100. But what they're giving that for is for the purposes of trying to hypertrophy the heart.
Mm-hmm.
So there is concern when we use anabolic steroids or other growth promotion agents over what we would call cardiac remodeling. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Effectively, what that means is the heart is a muscle. Yeah. And it is possible to remodel the heart through the application of growth promotion agents. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, normally we would see this as a side effect, a deleterious to one's health. Yeah. I don't want that to happen to my heart. Yeah.
Yeah.
But in a certain cohort of individuals, in certain individuals that are suffering from heart failure, okay, the application of these drugs where it potentially, and I use this word very, it's the wrong word, but strengthening the heart, as it were, right? Okay, potentially is a treatment methodology. Now that's, we're reading into it the wrong way if we're kind of saying like it's not bad for the heart, because it's actually doing what we don't want it to do the heart. Does that make
Mm-hmm.
sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what I would say is this: I think that clenbuterol used at moderate dosages is a drug that has a acceptable tolerance profile for most individuals most of the time. There are
Mm-hmm.
always going to be individuals that are hypersensitive to that class of compound and that should probably avoid it. Yeah. But this is a drug that has a great many clinical therapeutic practices. Yeah. There's lots of reasons they use it, including the application you were talking about. Yeah. But I wouldn't describe that as no deleterious effect to the heart. In fact, it's actually doing what we wouldn't want it to happen to the heart. So
Yep.
I would say, just be aware, there are clinical applications of clenbuterol all the way up to 2100 micrograms a day, which is wow. Wow, right? You're right. Okay. I would argue that, there's some good human clinical trials that are more in the vicinity of 120 micrograms a day that are supportive of its safe application in
Mm-hmm.
those individuals. Yeah. I don't use it at that dose typically. What I would say is we would start off at, say, 20 micrograms a day and then titrate for effect. Would you potentially go to as high as 120? Well, you could, but what I would typically lean into is what I call polypharmacy modeling, which basically means I would rather use 4 or 5 different potential pharmacological fat burners at relatively low dosages, each one of them contributing something to the mix. Yeah. So, for example, understanding that anabolic steroids contribute something to fat loss, growth hormone contributes to fat loss. We have a discussion about thyroid hormone
Yep.
manipulation. We have a discussion about yohimbine, you mentioned before, which is a different class of drug. We have a discussion about beta 2 androgenic agonists, which is the class clenbuterol fits into. So
Mm-hmm.
if you're going to be using a lot of these different compounds and they're all contributing something to the discussion, there's no reason to
Yep.
put your foot all the way to the floor on the gas.
Yeah.
I mean,
Absolutely.
so I would suggest that clenbuterol is certainly a drug that we don't need to see again as the boogeyman, on the understanding that that's dose dependent. Yeah. There's clinical application of clenbuterol all the way up to 2100 micrograms a day. Far more common is 120 micrograms a day. There's some latitude in there for for individuals who seem to tolerate the drug well, but like most things, there's a saying in pharmacology that says, "Look, the dose is the poison." Do you understand what that means? Yeah. For people listening, what that basically means is you can take the most benign of compounds, right? And if you push the envelope far enough, you will run into trouble. A classic example is something, it's a silly example, but it is actually true, and that is water, right? Without water, we die in about 3 days. We need water, right? So it's not like water is bad for us. But if you keep taking water, eventually you will reach the point whereby its application is deleterious to your health. You can't,
Absolutely.
you know,
Yeah.
so we should be aiming to drink about 4 liters of water a day. You go beyond that and more and more and more, eventually you start to create an environment where that's too much water and your health is going to start to suffer. Do you know what I mean?
Up. Yeah.
And
Totally.
and most drugs can be viewed through that filter or that lens, which says, look,
Mm-hmm.
some, okay, this is what we call an inverted J curve, right? Some we can probably tolerate, but as we escalate the dose, we start to see more and more plausible therapeutic benefits, right, and more problems. And we need to find the sweet spot in the middle of that J curve where we're realizing some therapeutic benefits, maybe not 100%, but
Mm-hmm.
at tolerable safety profiles, tolerable side effect profiles. So, clenbuterol, in my opinion, is a drug that fits very squarely into that inverted J curve. A little bit we can tolerate. What I say, let me explain the J curve because if there's people listening, I don't want to confuse them. Clenbuterol is in the class of drugs called beta 2 androgenic agonists.
Yes.
This is a class of compound in which normal drugs like adrenaline fit into. Yeah.
Mm.
So that's what I mean by that. The activation of the beta 2 androgenic agonist, some activation is positive. Some activation of adrenaline is plausibly a positive benefit to us, but too much of it is potentially deleterious. So in other words, that receptor pathway, not necessarily clenbuterol, but the
Yep.
beta 2 androgenic agonist pathway is an inverted J curve. Some activation is beneficial, too much is potentially deleterious.
Well, thank you. Thank
Cool.
you for clarifying that, Victor. And it was a fantastic connection with you. I'm so happy that we addressed on so many typical
Yeah,
bros.
we touched on a lot of things there, didn't
A lot of,
we? Yeah, I
lot of
touched on a lot of things there. Yeah.
common as a myth, much prevalent in today's society and towards the more over towards the younger population
Mm.
about the drug usage, how long they can go with the dosage, each and everything that we touched upon. I'm so thankful to you, Victor, and we'll hope to connect again soon. Until then, thank you so much for your time and happy Thanksgiving Day. Have a
I,
wonderful day.
I appreciate the opportunity, buddy. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.